Okay, today we're joined by Will Arnold, Head of Climate Action at the Institution of Structural Engineers. Welcome to the podcast, Will.
Hi, Gareth. Nice to join.
And I've invited Will along to introduce the new pilot net zero carbon building standard, which was published in September 2024. And with buildings thought to be responsible for a quarter of the UK's carbon emissions, pinning down what a net zero building is vital to hitting national net zero targets, never mind corporate net zero targets. But before we get onto the standard, Will, I like to ask my guests, how did you first get started in sustainability?
I went into sustainability not straight into my career. I spent the first sort of nearly a decade just as a fairly sort of bog standard structural engineer. I'd always questioned what was kind of useful about the projects that I was being asked to work on. And I remember in several of my sort of yearly appraisals talking at length about the sorts of things we build and what is good for this world and what is not good and where should we be putting our efforts. But the real turning point for me was 2018 when I went out to live in Rwanda for a year and work on the design of the Rwanda Institute for Conservation Agriculture. I was working at the time for ARUP. I'd been seconded out there to work for Master Design Group, who were leading the architecture and the engineering on it. And I went there because it seemed like a technical challenge and it seemed quite exciting. But that project kind of opened my eyes to what sustainability really meant on buildings. I'd always assumed a sustainable building was a low energy building, and that was kind of all you had to really think about. And I got there to find all these amazing engineers and architects talking about materials and this thing called embodied carbon and the broader sort of ecological health impacts of the different materials we use and so on. And we built that project for something like a third of the carbon footprint of the equivalent university buildings in the UK. And so when I came back to the UK, that kind of really stuck with me. And I spoke a lot about sustainable development goals and things like that with people, stuff that I'd started to learn in my year out there on this project. And that kind of led me into a place where I then started giving time towards the institution and eventually ended up working for the institution in the job that I now have.
Yeah. And what does your role, apart from working on the standard, what does your role at the institution consist of?
What do I actually do?
Yeah.
So in 2019, the board of the institution passed this mandate that from now on we were going to treat sustainability as equal to safety and life safety and structural safety, which was, safety had always been the sort of core tenet of why the institution existed. And we had this sort of group realization that sustainability is just long-term safety, right? So my job fundamentally was to enact that statement that had been put out by the board saying, how do you put sustainability on a par with safety? And so I've been working to get guidance written for members. We have written guidance, we run training courses, webinars, things like that. But then more fundamentally, raising the standards that we hold those members to. So to become a member of the Institution of Structural Engineers now, you would need to be able to demonstrate that you are fluent in embodied carbon. You understand it, you can reduce it, you can communicate about it. You would know the main ways to tackle it and be able to help others to do that. And a lot of that information we made for free, because the sort of third and final part of my job, and this I guess leads into the standard, the third part was always about this broader industry collaboration piece, right? So this acknowledgement that, so probably in most cases the structure makes up the majority of the embodied carbon on a single project, but that doesn't mean that the structural engineer is the only one who has control over it. It's a team effort. And so we always knew that we had to be able to create guidance and thought leadership and stuff that would help other disciplines as well, so that we could all speak the same language and kind of move forward together. So probably sort of like a third of my working time is actually spent on external projects to try and move the industry forward as a whole, to the benefits of the structural engineering profession and of course the public who we serve.
Yeah, and it's quite a big consortium put together to produce the standard, including REBA and the Green Building Council and the Building Research Establishment and many others. But set the context for this new standard. What problem is it trying to solve?
It's the problem it's trying to solve is that we haven't previously had an agreement within the UK built environments industry as to what a net zero building looks like, right? And that's led to a few problems because it means that people have to define it for themselves. which firstly, of course, can be costly and time consuming to try and work out what the goal is that you're aiming for. And the second problem, of course, is that we get everybody proclaiming all at the same time that their project is the first net zero such and such in the country, and then all disagreeing on what that means. And that takes us on to the final problem, which is that in most cases, what people mean by that statement is they just mean energy, or low energy, or maybe almost zero energy, but they only ever typically talked about energy in the past. And we still see this problem now. Right? If you look at the Future Home Standard consultation, it specifically excludes embodied carbon from its scope. So it's got nothing to do with materials, only looks at energy. So there was some research run led by the UK Green Building Council that I think happened in 2021 to try and get feedback from industry as to what they'd like to see to put an end to this lack of certainty. And all signs pointed to some form of standard, some kind of rule book that says these are all the aspects you need to consider. So you can't just look at energy, you also need to look at the following 7 things. And within those aspects, these are the levels of performance that you need to achieve in order to be aligned with the UK's net zero laws, the carbon budget we have as a country, all of those sorts of things. And so this idea of writing a net zero carbon buildings standard was born. Let's write the standard just for buildings, just for carbon, just to get us to net zero that aligns with that part of because there's law in the UK, right? Like this country has to be net zero by 2050, and that was really what sort of set the project going. And we kick-started properly with a steering group in early 2022, of which IStructE was a founding partner alongside the other 8 founding members, and we started to work out how on earth we were going to take on what seemed to be a ever bigger and bigger task.
Yes, I can imagine. And I suppose the fundamental question is, how does the standard define net zero?
Yeah, so I'll answer in a few minutes, but of course it took us 76 pages of A4 paper to actually define it. So you'll forgive me if I don't get all the details into here. I mean, the fundamental is that we took the UK's carbon budget and the UK's energy budget. We worked out how much of those could be allocated to buildings, and the 12 sectors that we've looked at, which is most of the buildings, both new buildings and retrofitted buildings, and we worked out how much carbon and energy that allowed you to expend on any given building. We also looked at the requirements of the UK in terms of generating renewable electricity going forwards, things like heating demand from buildings, connecting into distant networks, these various requirements. And we said for each of those requirements, we said, well, if your building performs in this way, and therefore hits this limit, this numerical limit, you are aligned with this aspect. And if you do this for all of the aspects, you're aligned with that bigger picture net zero carbon UK. And like a really common question is, well, do I have to offset? And a lot of people assume that's because, well, I would need to offset in order to cancel out my emissions, and that's how I get to net zero. The view we took on the standard is that offsetting is optional within the standard. You don't have to do that. You do have to do everything else. You can't pick and choose to do the other aspects, but offsetting is optional. And the reason for that is because of this idea of coming back to creating buildings that are aligned with a net zero carbon UK. If you do all these other things, you're aligned with net zero, we call your building a net zero carbon aligned building. If you also then offset the remaining emissions, you must do it in accordance with the section of the standard that goes into how you offset. And at that point, you can then say this is a net zero carbon aligned building and I've offset my residual emissions. But I think it's a really important point because the offsetting piece, there's a lot of debate about the usefulness of it these days, for and against, and we heard good reasons in both camps. So we said, let's put that to one side because the priority here has to be getting our emissions down below this budget, getting our energy use down below a budget that is sustainable over the longer term, generating renewable electricity and so on. So that's kind of where the definition, that's kind of where it comes from. Like I say, you have to read all 76 pages to fully get it out there, but that's the gist of it.
And from my skim reading of the standard, it suggests that it follows science-based targets in terms of what you have to achieve before offsetting. Is that correct? Did I read that right?
That's right. So the UK's carbon budget is based on a science-based trajectory. It's a 1.5 degree trajectory. We just heard yesterday announced at the COP that's going on at the moment in Baku that the UK is committing to an 81% reduction in carbon emissions by 2035, and so that manifests itself effectively as a graph that kind of goes downhill in this slide shape that we're all used to seeing. And if you take the area under that, that's the carbon budget for the UK. And within that, a certain amount is given over to buildings. And it's that amount that we then said, well, if we're building this much stuff every year and we've got this much carbon year on year, how quickly do we have to reduce those emissions? And we always refer to that exercise as a sort of top-down exercise. You take this top budget and you scale it down. That's the bit that checks that we're aligned with the science, with the science-based targets. And in parallel, we did what we call a bottom-up exercise, where we asked people to submit data for individual projects that they'd worked on, so that we could then look at the numbers for those projects and say, okay, do they meet the standard today? Does that tell us that these numbers are achievable, ambitious, somewhere in between, somewhere to either side? And that helped give us the sort of starting point for the numbers. And then when you combine these two things together, you can say, fine, if going into the future, starting at point X, we reduce at this rate, does that sit below that budget or does it exceed it? And the numbers in the back of the standard more or less fall within that budget, at least within the sort of margins of error that you'd expect for an exercise like this.
So basically, if you meet this standard, if every building in the UK met this standard, the UK would be, from the building stock, would be on track to meet the Paris Agreement of 1.5 degrees, whether offsetting was used or not.
Yeah, more or less. So we actually made an assumption about a percentage of projects not meeting the standard, because we've got to be realistic. We're not going to get 100% uptake overnight of this thing, obviously. But yes, if enough buildings were to perform in accordance with the standard, that would put the built environment and the buildings industry below that Paris line 1.5 degree trajectory. Yes.
Yeah. And that seems to be an increasing model across all sectors. Everybody wants a big, high-profile net zero by 20 whatever target, but underpinning it increasingly the science-based targets to sort of give it a bit of robustness.
Yeah.
So, if I could just pick up on one word, and I used aligned, and I saw it in the standard. A net zero carbon aligned building is the output, if I've got the phraseology right. Aligned, does that sort of take in uncertainties like user behavior?
No, so the aligned bit is referring to that alignment with that UK carbon budget. User behavior is an interesting topic, though, because what we did not want to do was write a standard that said you must design it out of these materials in this way, and the way it must perform is like this, and therefore you've got to get your tenants to turn off their lights at this time. And so, you could never do that. It'd be impossible. So the way the standard is approached is it's a performance-based standard. It says, build out of whatever you want, as long as your upfront carbon is below this level, and design your heating and your cooling and your lighting in whatever way you want, as long as the energy use is below this level. And then importantly, we then say, okay, you can't claim compliance with the standard, conformity with the standard, until you've actually measured all of that data, had the building occupied and in use for at least a year, and collected both the materials data and the energy data to demonstrate alignment. So the way we deal with user behavior and that sort of like making sure that people don't turn on the radiators and leave the windows open is basically just by saying, well, you've got to actually measure this stuff. And if you've left the radiators on with the windows open, by the time you come to take your electricity measurements at the end of the year, you might find you've exceeded all the limits, and then you don't have a net zero carbon aligned building. So it's going to require a bit of a shift in mentality for the way we build and the way we operate our buildings, because it will require contractors to keep a very close eye on materials whilst they are building, to make sure we're not using excess volumes over what we thought we needed, that we're not procuring higher carbon versions of the same product that we thought we were going to get. And then likewise, once the building's in use, the building owner or the facilities management team or whoever needs to keep a close eye on how the building's being used. Are is everyone leaving early? Does the air conditioning need to stay on for an extra 2 hours? What's happening in the summer? Are we using our external blind system the way it should have been used, or are we forgetting to turn it on? It will require people to do these sorts of things, but they're small behavioural shifts. They're not significant changes. We're not saying don't have the heating on in winter and don't have the cooling on in summer. This has been done with an understanding of what is achievable, but it will require some sort of input on behalf of the people building, maintaining, and using these buildings for sure.
Yeah, and then the other thing about, I suppose, alignment is how well does it align with existing building standards, such as BREEAM, that's been about for decades.
So I think what's interesting about the Net Zero Carbon Building Standard is that it's one of the only schemes out there that is as sort of holistic as it is, covering all these aspects that we need to tackle if the UK is to hit net zero by 2050. It's also on top of that, it's a as measured. So as I was just saying, you have to say measurements. It's not a design-based standard, and that sets it apart from kind of everything else that's out there, right? So things like BREEAM and LEED and so on will still have a role to play, but they don't necessarily tackle the same thing. Net Zero Carbon Building Standard is only tackling carbon. And the energy piece is part of the carbon piece, really. But the way it tackles it goes above and beyond what BREEAM or LEED can ever do. Another example is Neighbours, but Neighbours currently only tackles energy use. It does do that in a sort of as measured performance way, in the same way that we're doing. And one of the next steps we want to take on the standard is to do a piece of work around equivalence, to look at what of these other standards are equivalent to parts of ours, so that people wouldn't have to do the same piece of work twice. So maybe we'll find an agreement that if you've met the Neighbours' energy requirements, you don't have to double check our energy requirements. You can just tick that box. But at the moment, there's nothing else out there that does all of the things that the Net Zero Carbon Building Standard does. We know this from others as well. There's a group of investors called the LOTUF Group, LOTUF, and they published a piece of work at the start of the year. They had been asking, as investors, and they had something like $500 billion worth of real estate around the world, so it was a pretty big portfolio between them. They're saying, as investors, how do we invest in low carbon building projects going forwards? Because we have ESG requirements, we have to report against this, so some of our money has to go into those sorts of projects. And they said, but the things we need to see is we need to see that the projects are tackling whole life carbon, number one, that it's in use measurements, not design, number two, and then it's third party verified, number three. And out of all of the schemes and standards that they reviewed, the only one in the world that they could find that was doing this was the UK Net Zero Carbon Building Standard. So we do think it sort of fills a niche that's needed filling, and we hope that it will help others, maybe in other countries, to sort of build on what we've done as well, actually.
Yes. And how's the market reacted to the standard? Has anybody actually tried implementing it yet, or is this why it's still in the pilot stage?
So it's in the pilot stage, but it is fully usable. You can download it from the website now, and you can try using it on a project today. And our inbox is full, which I think tells you there's a lot of interest in this. We held a launch webinar a couple of weeks ago, which is now available online to watch, and 2,500 people turned up. So there's real interest in this. We've got a lot of people saying they're going to put forward projects for the pilot testing scheme that's about to open. We're running a pilot testing scheme as a sort of scheme rather than just saying get on and use it and tell us what you think. You can also do that if you don't want to be part of this formalized scheme. That's fine. There's a feedback form on the website, and already we're getting lots of feedback coming through. But we're also going to run a sort of formalized scheme so that people working through this can do so together, so that we can take feedback from them back into our technical steering group and feedback to them if things need to change. And that when we then launch version 1 at the end of next year, it could have used all of that data and all of that knowledge. And we've got loads of people saying they want to be part of that. They've got projects they want to put in. So the uptake's been really, really positive and really, really great. The other thing that's been quite nice to see has been companies and firms doing one of two. There's two things that have stood out. One is there's a bunch of companies out there that have started producing guidance on how to use the standard, and they've written this themselves, not necessarily having been involved in its development. which obviously always fills me with horror when I first see it, because I go, oh my goodness, what if they've misunderstood it? I'll have a quick read through, and by and large, what I've seen has been pretty positive. I mean,
Yeah.
there's always room for improvement, of course. But that's been really nice, right? Because that's the industry taking this thing already within a couple of months of it being launched and saying, we're going to own this, we're going to write guidance around using it, and we're going to try and push it out, even if we didn't have any part in its creation. And the second of the two nice things that I've seen is companies taking projects that they've already finished, that they already have carbon and energy data for, and publicly putting out their numbers compared to the standards numbers and saying, look, this project would have met it if we put it through. We're pretty sure. And they can't say that for sure until they've done, a full assessment, got it verified and so on. But I think it's a really nice indicator that people are already sort of marking their own homework against it to see what does a building look like if it aligns with the standard. And we're getting more and more examples sort of filtering through, which is really nice.
Absolutely. And do you foresee it fitting into like a government policy framework, whether it's national government or, local plans or at a local authority level? Do you see it becoming part of that process?
It was never written directly for that. I mean, the reason it was written was to help people make change happen now. We know that policy takes time. Whether it's central or local, there's a bit of a lag, and it's taken us long enough to write the damn thing. So it was always about enabling, private investor with a private developer and private design team to go ahead and do it. But having said that, it's had a lot of interest from local authorities, from various city councils around London, and even from some of the central government civil service departments. So they're all aware that it's out there, and they're all looking at it and saying, what can we do with it? So I think it will affect policy. Whether it becomes directly adopted as a whole thing or not, I don't know. My hope would be that it does, because one of the main bits of resistance to introducing policy in this space has always been a complaint that there's not consistency in what's out there. So it would be a bit silly if then the response to that was for everyone to write different versions of the standard to try and fill the consistency gap, when we now have one thing backed by the whole of industry. So we're working on that. But I think in the meantime, like I said, there's nothing to stop people from getting on with it and using it now. And I think that as well will help give confidence to policymakers that this stuff is achievable. It is doable today. It requires materials to decarbonize, because if you look at the upfront carbon limits, they do drop down quite quickly, and that's all down to what we've heard from the materials sector about what they can do. It requires you to think about energy use and the way we operate our building with a bit more depth than we currently do, but it's all achievable. Therefore, we should enact policy around this, because we need to start grappling with this very significant percentage of the country's emissions,
So it's probably more likely to appear in terms of, I suppose, client specifications rather than a planning framework. Would that be a more likely starting position?
In the immediate term, yes, because if a client was hiring you to design a building for them tomorrow, they could put it into their specification now. And if you were looking at setting up a framework for your next building project, and you were due to start hiring your design team in the next few months, you could literally take the standard off the website now. Well, you wouldn't even have to download it. You just have to say, in accordance with the net zero carbon building standard, and your team could design in that way. But I do think in time we will see it filter through to policy in some way. It might be that what you see is your local authority saying, to get planning, you have to have done all of the assessments in accordance with the standard, but maybe not met the limits, because they might decide for them those limits are too ambitious. Or it might be a variation on that, but there'll be something out there. It's only going to go in one direction. The rest of the world is regulating on this topic now. The whole of the EU has to report carbon on their buildings by 2028. Australia is introducing optional regulations around this from next year. That will then, over time, become mandatory. California's already doing it. I think Singapore are looking at it. It will happen here at some point. And now that we have the standard, we have a way of people having a sort of consistent starting point, consistent language for all that. So it's going to come through. But you're right. In the immediate term, this is for owners and developers and financiers to say, if you want a better deal on your loan to go build a building, you need to be net zero in accordance with the standard. Or if you're going to design my project for me, you need to do it in accordance with the standard. That's what we're going to see in the short term, for sure.
Yeah, and the blurb around the standard says it's designed to evolve, or it's expected to evolve. And you said version 1 will be out next year. But what would your personal priority be if in the first revision process? What do you feel it needs to be developed more?
I think, well, really, it needs testing, right? It needs testing on real projects. There's between now and version 1 launching, which will be late next year, there's a few bits of work that are standalone to each other. So there's the equivalence thing I already mentioned about understanding whether getting BREEAM, outstanding would give you certain parts of the standard have already been met. So there's that. There's a piece of work being done around delineation, because at the moment, either the whole building is net zero or it's not. And that, of course, means that it gets more complex when you have 25 tenants over 25 stories in a building, as to how you control the energy use of all of them. So there's a bit of work to look at, can we introduce delineation clauses so that if only one tenant does it, they can claim compliance even if the others don't. And we need to write the verification piece, which then says, well, when you've done your assessment and you reckon you've met all your limits, what you give all of this to the verifier, what do they have to do for them to be able to say, we've checked it, we've verified it, it's good, here's your certificates. So we've got to do all of that. But the most important bit, in a way, whilst that's going on, is the pilot testing. Because at the moment, all the numbers are based on, probably the most extensive bit of work done in the space in the UK ever. 500 something projects worth of embodied carbon data and a few thousand worth of operational energy data. But having said that, none of that data was written necessarily in the same way. These are data from different projects, written by different people, mostly conforming to the RICS professional standard, but without any real way of us being able to check it line by line. Whereas the data that will come in for the pilot testing will have all been written up in accordance with the standards. So we'll have real certainty over those numbers that come through. And I think that to me, personally, that's the last bit I'm really looking forward to seeing happen, because I've got pretty good confidence that we're going to get to the end of next year. The limits are going to stay the same. None of that's going to change, but we're going to be able to say, look, here's 5 hospitals that have actually already been built that all meet it. And those numbers have been checked in accordance with the standards, so the scope is exactly the same, and we know that it's doable. So for me, that's the last bit of the puzzle that's going to get closed out over the next year. It's just that sort of real body of proof that tells us that what we've written is definitely doable, and we can then put it out the door as version 1, and off we go. It's the real thing, then. It's quite exciting.
Yeah, and I suppose a lot. Probably most of the listeners here be more interested in occupying a net zero building rather than designing and building one. So it will give them a great scope for specification, because I know, one of the reasons why I raised the policy angle is, the whole sag over zero carbon homes, which seemed to just drag on until everybody gave up on the concept. So I can see why this would be so attractive for people who are looking for zero carbon buildings to occupy to meet their own zero carbon targets. Yeah,
I mean, you will be one of the first to be able to say we work in a net zero carbon aligned building, verified to a standard that is backed by the whole industry. And I mean that particularly in the early days, that's going to make you pretty special compared to the rest. And I don't. In a way, once it does become part of planning and regulation, all of those sorts of things, it'll become quite normalised. But in the interim, it's going to be a real, it'll really set you apart from all of the competition who will be sat there in, crusty old way of doing things, which is not net zero at all. It uses too much energy and uses too much material to make in the first place. So it'll be if you're interested in being able to say that everything you do is on board with the sustainability journey that this country is going on, this standard gives you, the quickest way to go doing that on an individual project, definitely.
And that's fantastic. And as Will said, the standard is freely available, or the pilot standard is freely available. I just Googled it. I had to go scroll past the adverts from some of the companies that you were talking about to put their guidance up. But the standard is freely available alongside that webinar. which I haven't yet watched, but I will do. Can you remember the URL off the top of your head, Will?
Yeah, it's NZC Buildings, plural, .co.uk. So nzcbuildings.co.uk.
Excellent, but I think Google will help you remember that rather than remembering that. Okay, well, it just leaves me to thank you, Will, for joining me today to talk through that. That was fascinating, and I certainly learnt a huge amount more about the standard than skimming the website. So thank you very much.
Fantastic. No, it's been really nice to talk about it. Thanks very much.